Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the next episode of Middle School Myth Busters, but no copyright infringement intended. No, seriously, no copyright infringement intended, all right? So, but Mythbusters, it's such an awesome name, we're going to stick with it. But Middle School Mythbusters. Now, if you remember in episode number one, we covered World War II myth that middle school students believe. And we talked about the fact that a lot of middle school students think that dictators tell everyone what they're going to do immediately and everyone just goes, yeah, let's do it. And we had talked about the fact, no, this is how dictators actually operate. And we also talked about the fact this is how people operate. Well, we covered that, and that was very important. That way, when we actually learned about World War II, we didn't have any myths that we believed that would then skew how we actually learned about World War II. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we are learning about Latin America history. And now we've already covered plant goods and animal goods that came to the New World. We've covered languages that came to the New World. We've covered religious beliefs that have come to the New World. Well, now we're going to talk about slaves that came to the New World. So we're going to be learning about the transatlantic slave trade. But in order to learn about the transatlantic slave trade, which is where West African peoples were taken as slaves to the New World, before we can learn about that, we actually need to know what are the middle school myths that students believe, and we need to talk about why those myths are incorrect. Because once we do that, then we can learn about the transatlantic slave trade, just like we learned about World War II. We can learn about it, and we won't have any myths in the back of our mind that kind of skew the way we learn about it or skew our vision of those events, okay? Now, ladies and gentlemen, before we begin, guess what? There is a bonus. Well, the bonus is each of the myths that we talk about are the answer to a bonus question on the Latin America history test, which will probably happen in 4 weeks. So each myth we cover is going to be the answer to a bonus question. So it is probably a good idea if you write down these myths and you memorize these myths. Well, first of all, memorize the myth so that you don't actually believe them and you know that they are myths. Also, write them down so that you can remember them, so that you can score a ton of bonus points on the upcoming test. All right, and think about it. I don't normally give out what the bonus questions are going to be, so this is a bonus for you. So, yeah, we'll go with that. Bonus. All right, ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, slavery myth that middle school students believe. Myth number one. Student myth number one. The word slave refers to black people. No, actually it doesn't. The word slave refers to anyone who is kidnapped, sold, and forced against their will to do work. That's a slave. It doesn't matter if that slave has white skin, if that slave has black skin. It doesn't matter what ethnic group that slave belongs to. You are a slave. It doesn't matter what ethnic group you belong to. You are a slave if you are kidnapped, sold, and forced against your will to do work. Now, by the way, that's only one definition of slavery if you look throughout human history, but we're covering the one that's going to make most sense with the transatlantic slave trade. So, again, if you are kidnapped, sold, and forced against your will to do work, you're a slave. It has nothing to do with skin color. In fact, not only does it have nothing to do with skin color, the very word slave actually comes from the Slavic people. If you remember when I gave you that language tree, I think it was in September, we talked about the 3 main branches of European languages. We said branch 1 was Romance, or what we call Latin languages. We said branch 2 was Germanic languages, and branch 3 were Slavic languages. Slavic languages would be Russian, Ukrainian, Polish, Bulgarian, Belarusian, all right? Now, when we said, okay, those languages are Slavic, well, the people who live in those areas are also called Slavs, okay? Now, so many of those people, if you look throughout recorded history, so many of those people were sold and forced to do work that the word Slav, which just referred to them, that word Slav morphed and turned into the word slave. So slave is based on the fact that you had millions of Slavs that were sold and forced to do work. Now, ladies and gentlemen, here's what Slavs look like. Here's a picture of Slavs. Here's another picture of Slavs. Here's a third picture of Slavs. You're going to notice something. They aren't black. And yet so many of these people were captured, sold, and forced to do work that we get the word slave from the fact that so many of these people were made into slaves. Okay? So again, myth number one, slave refers to black people. No. Every group, it doesn't matter where you are, and by the way, there's been slavery all over the globe. Right? Every continent has dealt with slavery. Guess what? It's just, are you kidnapped? Are you sold and forced to do work? You're a slave. And it's based on the fact that so many of these people were enslaved. Okay? So, myth number one, gone. Myth number two. Slavery means Africans being enslaved by Europeans. No, absolutely not. Now, have Africans been enslaved by Europeans? Absolutely. Have Europeans been enslaved by Africans? Absolutely. Have Asians enslaved Africans? Yes. Have Europeans enslaved Asians? Have Asians enslaved Europeans? Have Africans enslaved Asians? Yes. Right. The point is, look here. This is our wonderful map of the world. Every continent has had slavery. Doesn't matter. If you look through history, Asians enslaved other Asians. Africans enslaved other Africans. Europeans enslaved other Europeans. North American groups enslaved other North American groups. South American people, I don't know why I said groups there, North American people enslaved other North American people. South American people enslaved other South American people. If you go out to the Pacific Islands, Pacific Islanders enslaved other Pacific Islanders. In fact, the only continent that has never had slavery is Antarctica, because nobody lives there. All right. So, in other words, for 6,000 years of human history, there's always been slavery. And if you have continents who are close to each other, like Europe, Africa, and Asia, you remember how I just said that probably about a minute ago? Europeans enslaved Africans, but Africans enslaved Europeans. Africans enslaved other Asians. Asians enslaved Africans. Asians enslaved other Europeans. Europeans enslaved other Asians. And when you get over here, all right, if you're close enough in terms of groups, you're going to see the same thing over and over again. Everyone dealt with slavery. And here's the thing. For most of the 6,000 years of human history, everybody thought it was normal. It's only been the last 250 years that people looked around and went, hey, you know what? Actually, slavery is wrong. I think it's actually a moral evil. For most of human history, whether you were in Africa, Asia, Europe, South America, North America, or out in the Pacific Islands, everyone thought slavery was normal. Now, nobody liked being a slave. Nobody wanted to be a slave, but they just thought it was a normal part of life. Hey, there's some people who are free and some people who are slaves. Now, by the way, does that mean that slavery is right? No, slavery is not right. Am I saying that slavery is right? Absolutely not. Slavery is not right. But what I'm saying is, if you just think slavery is European people enslaved Africans, that's what slavery is? No, slavery was globe-wide. It is true, I can actually say this as a history teacher, every ethnic group, I don't care if it's an ethnic group in Africa, Asia, Europe, North America, South America, out in the Pacific Islands. Every ethnic group, when you look at their history, at one point in time, they have been a slave master. In other words, they have been the master of slaves. And at other points in their history, they have been the slave themselves. It's just been the way that human history has worked. It's been terrible, but it's the way that human history has worked. It's not one group doing something to another group, and that's all it is. Every group has engaged in slavery. Every group has been a slave. Now, if you don't believe me, take a look at this. The pyramids. The pyramids are in Egypt. Egypt's in Africa. The pyramids, built by slaves. The Great Wall of China, built by slaves. The Mayan temples that you can find in South America and Central America. Central America is part of North America, built by slaves. The Parthenon in Greece. Greece is in Europe, built by slaves. In In fact, pretty much any large structure that was built before 1850 was built by slaves. All right? There was no Great Wall of China construction company. There were no Pyramids R Us. You built all your things with slaves, and everyone thought it was normal. All right, this is a picture of Squanto. Squanto is a Native American. If you have learned anything about the Pilgrims in elementary school, when the Pilgrims came to the New World after they survived unbelievably harsh winter, the Indian group that came to help them, the Native American group that came to help them, they had a slave with them named Squanto. So this was a Native American group that had enslaved another Native American from a different tribe. He happened to speak English. He was able to talk to the Pilgrims. But the point is, the Native Americans enslaved each other. So slavery was just a globally wide, however you want to say that. It has nothing to do with Europeans as evil and Africans as victims. Every group did it, and every group was fine with it as long as they weren't enslaved themselves. Again, only in the last 250 years have people realized, you know what, this isn't correct, and then tried to stop it. All right, slavery myth number 3. Transatlantic slavery is different because slaves were taken to another country, or to another continent. Well, no. If you just remember from what I talked about, you had Africans enslaving Europeans, you had Europeans enslaving Asians, Asians enslaving Africans, Africans enslaving Asians, the whole mix. I'm sure I missed one combination. But the point is, way before the transatlantic slave trade, slaves were taken to different continents. I'm going to show you a couple of pictures. All right, so this is some artwork that was done. Europeans had to deal with the Barbary pirates. The Barbary pirates are North African. Okay, so from the continent of Africa, the Barbary pirates were notorious for kidnapping Europeans and then selling them in Africa, or kidnapping Europeans and selling them in Asia. All right? The Barbary pirates, nobody liked the Barbary pirates. They're responsible for, I believe it's the enslavement of over 1 million people, a million Europeans. That's not even counting the Asians. All right? So this is a picture where you can tell there's Englishmen fighting against Barbary pirate. Notice that the pirate is black. This is the bad guy. This is the guy who's doing the enslaving. He's not a slave. So, and if you look at, think the Marine Corps anthem. If you've ever heard the Marines do their song, the American Marines. From the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli. Well, Tripoli is the capital of Libya. Libya is in North Africa. Why are the Marines talking about being in North Africa? Because they had to fight the Barbary pirates, because you had Americans as well who were getting kidnapped by the Barbary pirates and sold into slavery. So, cross-continental slavery has existed long before the transatlantic slave trade. Now, by the way, does that mean that the transatlantic slave trade, slaves that were taken to the Americas, does that make it right? No. Is it still evil? Absolutely. But is it the first time that this has ever happened? Absolutely not. It was happening for centuries before, and we have to remember that. So again, doesn't make slavery right, doesn't make the transatlantic slavery right. But we have to recognize the entire world, for most of the 6,000 years of human history, the entire world was like this. All right, by the way, here's another picture. This would be Asian slave traders. And you notice these are the slaves in the artist's work. This guy's the slave master. These are the slaves. Notice what color they are, because they're European slaves who are being shipped to Southwest Asia. So, slaves moving from continent to continent happened all the time, and centuries before the transatlantic slave trade. All right, myth number 4. We got 5 myths total. So myth number 4, transatlantic slavery was caused by racism. No, all right? Racism is the effect of slavery, but it's not the cause of slavery. So here's what I mean, all right? When you are thinking about slavery throughout human history, whatever characteristic of the slave made them different from the rest of the free population that characteristic was hated. So in history, you had some slaves they did certain jobs. Well, if those jobs were really different from what the rest of the population would do, those jobs were hated because those jobs were associated with slaves. In some places, if the slaves had a certain religious belief, so let's say that the slaves were Christians, well then Christianity would be the thing that was hated because the rest of the free population weren't Christians, and so Christianity, I'm using Christianity as an example, by the way, it is true. And when you look at history, there's certain parts in Christianity would have been that. But Christianity was associated with slavery, and therefore Christianity was hated. Well, with the transatlantic slave trade, ladies and gentlemen, what's the defining characteristic that would have made the slaves different from the surrounding population? Their skin color. So, therefore, having black skin became something that was hated and something that was looked down on. All right? Notice that that's the effect. And by the way, this you can look at any amount of historical records. This is always the case. When any population is enslaved, whatever characteristic makes them different from the rest of the surrounding people, that characteristic is hated. So whether it's religious beliefs, whether it's the type of work that the slaves did, or whether in the case of transatlantic slavery, skin color. All right? So, you have to understand, it's the effect of slavery, it's not the cause of slavery. And if you're thinking, effect of slavery, cause of slavery, well, what does that mean? Okay? Well, I want you to think about this. If it's the cause of slavery, so if racism is the cause of slavery, then what you have is a bunch of people in Europe going, hey, you know what? I don't like black people. Do you like black people? No, I don't like black people. Hey, let's go to Africa and make some slaves. Well, that's not how slavery works, right? Slavery actually works in this case like this. Hey, what's the easiest group of people to enslave that nothing will come back on us and nobody can get revenge on us? Oh, that group of people? All right, that's the group of people that we're going to attack, all right? Now, in the case of transatlantic slave trade, this would have been Europe in 1330, okay? Now, notice all the different kingdoms. You can barely see a present-day country in Europe. So even in what should have been Spain, you had the Kingdom of Castile and the Kingdom of Aragon, France. I mean, like a little bit of this was France, but you had Brittany over here. That's kind of its own kingdom. Look at all these different kingdoms. Well, guess what? If I'm someone who, whether I'm a Barbary pirate in North Africa, whether I am a slave trader in Europe, man, I can attack just about any town or village. I mean, what's the Kingdom of Aragon going to do? All right, I can just go to the Kingdom of Castile and I'll be fine. I can raid all sorts of villages because there's so many different kingdoms and they don't have enough strength by themselves to make me really scared. All right, their armies are going to be limited because their kingdoms are limited and their kingdoms are always changing. And if I were to actually kind of zoom in on the Holy Roman Empire, there are hundreds of little kingdoms. This isn't even one big kingdom. So guess what? Because everyone in Europe right now are acting like tribes and they're focused on their clan or family, clan, C-L-A-N, clan or family, it's easy to raid all through Europe and just take whatever slaves I want. All right? Boom. This is Europe in about 1770, or 1700. Take a look. Do you see, now besides here in Germany where you still have a lot of mini kingdoms, look at most of Europe. They're huge kingdoms or empires. Well, guess what? If I'm a slave trader, I am not interested in trying to attack. Remember when this was Castile and Aragon? I'm not interested in attacking Spain because guess what? Now I'm going to have to fight all of Spain and the Spanish army. If I attack France, I've got all of France. If I attack over here, because this is where the Slavs would have been, man, I've got the Ottoman Empire would have been okay with slavery, but I've got the Habsburg Empire. I've got empires here. This is not a good idea. So, as Europe is becoming a country, they have these huge armies and huge empires. Well, if I start attacking towns in that huge army or empire, now all of a sudden I have to face the full weight of their military. That's not good. So I'm going to look for a place that doesn't have huge countries. Africa, all right? Africa, at this point in time, There's still a bunch of tribes, and the tribes are focused on just my tribe or my clan or my family. So they don't have some huge country, some huge standing army to be able to fight against. All right? That's the easier route to go. If you're a slave trader, you always go with what is the easiest victim. All right? That's who I'm going for. So fight an entire army or go down to Africa where everyone is still working within a tribe and not as a country or nation. That is another reason for slavery with the transatlantic slave trade. It wasn't about skin color, it's about what's easiest. Okay, remember, slave traders, they don't have any morals. They're just about, hey, what's the easiest victim to get? That's what I'm going for. And by the way, we'll talk about this in the slave trade video. In the transatlantic slave trade video. You gotta remember, even at this time, when you get to 1700s and this isn't a good place to get slaves, guess what? African tribes were the ones selling other Africans to the Europeans. That's the only reason that the slave trade even existed in West Africa. But that's a story for a different day. We'll talk about that more when we get to the actual video on the slave trade. All right, boom. Slavery myth number 5. And yes, this video is going long, but we have a lot of myths to cover. This is the last myth. Slavery does not exist today. That is also a lie. Ladies and gentlemen, we call it human trafficking today. But now, the only difference is most of the world recognizes that it is wrong and is trying to fight against it. But human trafficking still exists today. Slavery, by the way, not even just human trafficking, but the idea of slavery still exists in parts of Africa and still exists in parts of Southeast Asia to this day. All right? But human trafficking exists all over the globe. So A21, the reason why I put that group there is because that is a known human trafficking group that deals with rescuing men, women, and children out of human trafficking. So, and by the way, they're not the only group. There are a lot of different groups that deal with rescuing people out of human trafficking. A21 statistic, 27 million people are still in bondage, meaning are enslaved around the globe. 1% to 2% of victims are ever rescued, so only about 1% to 2% are even rescued. The average age of a trafficking victim in today's world, 12 years old. Right? That's today. So 8 billion people on the planet, it's estimated about 27 million of the 8 billion people that live on Earth are slaves. Okay? So that should break that myth if you believe, slavery kind of ended with the Civil War. Well, no, there's slavery all around the globe. And just like we talked about before, it has nothing to do with skin color. We're talking about what is a slave? Anyone who's kidnapped, sold, and forced to do work, that is a slave. So slavery still exists today. So those, ladies and gentlemen, are your 5 myths. If you need to go back through the video, go back through the video. Remember, those will be bonus questions. If you have any questions for me, you can talk to me, and you can also email me if you need to. All right? So ladies and gentlemen, take care.